what must science begin? Then we're just going to go through, we're just going to plod through, I'm afraid. So we're going to look at being, nothing, becoming. I would say everything sort of, well, depending on what you think about the being, nothing, becoming dialectic, everything chugs along quite happily until you get to the transition from becoming to determinate being or Dasein, which is a little bit tricky. So I would say, I'm never going to say stop reading. Carry on by all means. However, if you've got up to Dasein, which is determinate being, you've done fine. You don't need to go any further than that. Just so you know how to make sense of the text, the logic is carried forward in certain parts of the text, but it's not carried forward in other parts of the text, and Hegel usually identifies those as remarks. So, for example, you've got then being, nothing, and becoming, which is clearly moving the logic forward, but then you've got 4 longish remarks that don't move the logic forward at all. They sort of explain various things, and they deal with objections, and they're fascinating, they're very interesting, and I would certainly say read them. But in a way, if you're short on time, you don't need to read them, and I haven't included them in the reader, for example, because I didn't have enough space. Although there is interesting stuff in that. Then the logic picks up again after those remarks with the moments of becoming, coming to be, and ceasing to be, then the sublation of becoming, then there's another remark, and then we get into some introductory stuff with Dasein, and then the logic picks up again in a subsection of Dasein. So I'll try and guide you, but just be alerted to the fact that Hegel will have these remarks. He'll often also have anticipatory sort of summaries of where you're going to go. And, you don't always need those. Anyway, I hope that's clear. So with what must science begin, and then if you can read being, nothing, and becoming, and stop with the transition to Dasein. All right, so I've suggested that Hegel's logic, what's distinctive about Hegel's logic and makes it different from Fichte's derivation of the categories and Kant's derivation of the categories such as it is that it's meant to be radically presuppositionalist, systematically presuppositionalist. But that does not mean that it does not have historical and linguistic presuppositions. In fact, I have a whole chapter in this book called The Presuppositions of Presuppositionalist Thought. So, that's not something that Hegel's disputing. The obvious historical presupposition of the logic is that, I suppose, provided by what I was talking about before, the modern spirit of the age, the Reformation, the French Revolution, Rousseau, Kant, Fichte, modern freedom, modern self-criticism, thou shalt not take for granted, overthrow authority, don't allow stuff just to be given to you. Well, what's the philosophical implication of that? Don't just start from a beginning that you say, well, it is like that, where it has some determinate, substantial character. Now, for Hegel, the only alternative to that is to begin with utter indeterminacy. So you can see this as well as a kind of consequence of a sort of radical skepticism, and that is another way into Hegel. Think of Hegel as sort of taking Cartesian skepticism to its sort of logical conclusion. So that is certainly a historical presupposition of the logic. And Hegel acknowledges his debt to Aristotle, to Kant, to Fichte, to Schelling, and so on. So also logic has linguistic presuppositions. For Hegel, one must be able to speak a language and articulate the development of thought in language. Hegel is, although he knew and sort of schmoozed with a number of the romantics at the time, he is not a romantic in that he thinks that thought, as it were, happens only insofar as it's articulated in language. He's not the kind of figure that you get at moments of Nietzsche, for example, where Nietzsche thinks his language is not up to expressing the insights. And of course that becomes a familiar kind of trope in a lot of 20th century literature and drama. Language breaking down as a kind of mark of authentic feeling. That the more authentic I am, the more I stutter and I can't. No, Hegel hates that. That's not right. All you get with the ineffable is emptiness, vacuity. So, language is central. And indeed, one of the challenges that this then puts on us, and it explains partly the difficulty of Hegel's text, is how do you write in a way that you articulate this emergence of a content in the thinking itself? You need to develop what Hegel calls speculative sentences. Now, he talks about these in the preface to the Phenomenology, which, by the way, I haven't put on here, but the preface to the Phenomenology is a really great introduction to Hegel's whole system. And he has, towards the end of that, a discussion of Hegel on speculative sentences. And I've written a bit about this, actually, in this book, and also my first book on Hegel and Nietzsche. Broadly speaking, very, very simply, a speculative sentence, as opposed to a judgment, is one that doesn't have a fixed subject. And in fact, it's one that actually can't just happen by itself. It has to be part of a chain of speculative sentences in which what the predicate does is clarify the nature of the subject, allow the nature of the subject to become apparent, to emerge, as opposed to an ordinary judgment which identifies something. There's the book is Greek. What it is to be the book doesn't emerge in that sentence. I've got the book, I know what it is. It's Greek. It's difficult, or whatever. Speculative sentences are sentences in which the subject matter emerges. And a lot of Hegel's sentences are like that, which is often why they're so long, why they seem to change the topic in the middle of them. And it is a difficulty, but it's a deliberate difficulty. That's not just bad style on Hegel. That's deliberate. And so Hegel is like Fichte, and I would say, with great respect to Kant, probably unlike Kant. Hegel is acutely aware of the problem of how do you write, how do you speak in a way that enables speculative thought to utter itself. Now, some commentators like Gadamer think that Hegel is so obsessed with language that in fact it's language that determines where everything goes in the logic, or a lot of it. And indeed Gadamer has even claimed that it's really only in German that you can do speculative thinking. I don't think that's right. Hegel is not reducing thought to language, and he's certainly not saying that you have to speak German to be able to think speculatively. However, you do have to give attention to language, and the difficulties involved in using language to think indeterminacy are apparent right at the very beginning of the logic. So if you've got, this is page 82 or page 59. Page 59 in the DiGiovanni, 82 in the Miller. It's the first, it's not even a sentence, it's a sentence fragment on being. Hegel writes, being, pure being, there's actually I think a dash in the German. Yeah, the dash, comma, and then a dash. Without any further determination. Now, obviously, if we didn't know, if we had no sense at all of what words like being, pure, without any further determination meant, if that was just like me going woof, 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 then you couldn't do this. You've got to know what those words mean. You've got to know what without means, any means. Obviously. You've got to have some sense of what being means, such that you can think being without any further determination. And so at that point, you think being, oh yeah, I know what I mean, and then Hegel says, just forget everything you know about it. So what those words are doing, while we're looking at them, are actually, they're standing as a kind of injunction to you. They're not providing a definition. Now you could give a definition of being. Being is that which has no determination. But of course that would define being explicitly as not being determined, as indeterminate. But then for Hegel that would just determine it. Because to determine something is to define it in terms of what it's not. So if you define being as not determinate, as indeterminate, you haven't got indeterminacy at all. You've just got determinate indeterminacy, which is not indeterminacy. So these words are not defining being. They're telling you what to do. Think being, and then stop. Just don't go any further. Don't add any further determinations at all. So, it's not in the form of a judgment, it's not in the form of a sentence, it's a sentence fragment that is a kind of injunction. But it's words doing the job of directing you towards pure indeterminate being. And it's directing you by telling you not to add any further determinations. Let's carry on. In its indeterminate immediacy, it's equal only to itself. It is also not unequal relatively to another. It has no diversity within itself, nor any with a reference outward. Now let's just take that last bit. It has no diversity. Again, that's not defining being as lacking diversity. It's saying of being that there is no diversity in it. And that you shouldn't think of it as having diversity, or indeed as contrasting with diversity. It just lacks diversity. Diversity is absent. Now, you don't know this yet, but later on when Hegel gets to the logic of essence, he thematizes these differences, because there we have categories which include within themselves what they exclude, and that's a theme that Hegel's very interested in. How moments of exclusion are built into what it is to be something. So identity, for example, is as identity the excluding of difference, the not being different. Being is not identity, because being is not the not being diverse. And equally as well, being is not the not being nothing. And this might be a different, my current view, which I've written about, is that this is quite a big difference between Hegel and Parmenides. For Parmenides, being makes no sense unless one also adds the thought that nothing is not. And of course you know the problems that Parmenides gets into is how do you think nothing is not if nothing isn't? And then you get Plato taking this up in the Sophists and so on. There's a whole sort of series of thoughts about that. But it seems that Parmenides wants to stabilize being by marking it off. Being can be thought, marking it off against nothing, which isn't, which can't be thought. Which can't be thought to such a degree, how do you even think it as that which can't be thought? I don't think Hegel thinks of being like being is not nothing. Being is being, is being, is being. In its utter, it is indeterminate, but it's not defined as indeterminacy. Dieter Henrich, in the article on Anfang und Methode, the beginning and method of the logic, examines in more detail the way that some of these other phrases work, like indeterminate immediacy, which, immediacy. Okay, immediacy obviously makes sense only when it's contrasted with mediation. But if you add the qualifier indeterminate, Henrich argues, what Hegel is doing is taking away that implication of immediacy through the qualifying adjective. So being is immediacy, but it's indeterminate immediacy. Don't think of it as immediacy as opposed to mediation. Now, we can come back to these ideas. What I'm trying to get you to see at the minute is simply that Hegel is well aware that he needs to use language in a certain way in order to try and direct one's thinking, particularly at the very beginning, at this pure thought. But it continues throughout the logic, actually, and one of the things that we're trying to do throughout the logic, in a sense, is almost have a split brain. Because one part of your brain has got to inhabit the real world, know, all about the complexities of life, know what language is, how it operates, and the other part of your brain has got to use that language to hold at bay all of those implications, to abstract from them, to set them to one side, and not to set them to one side such that they are surreptitiously built into the very thing that you're thinking. There will be concepts in essence that do build into the concept, the very thing that's excluding. But Hegel doesn't think that has to happen all the way. So we can think something, for example, by bracketing out any naturalistic implications. Just think something. We can abstract. That's what it amounts to. And so what's going on here is that language is used to abstract. Now, obviously, if you can't use language in this way, you can't do the logic. So language is obviously a presupposition. Nonetheless, what language and history and perhaps one's own capacity to understand, a kind of hermeneutic capacity, are presuppositions, but they're not founding presuppositions. Richard Winfield coined the term enabling conditions. I think that's quite a helpful word. These are enabling conditions of the logic, but they're not founding systematic assumptions or presuppositions, and they do not predetermine how the logic is going to unfold. In fact, if anything, they are the conditions under which alone you can think presuppositionlessness. Okay, a few other things follow from this. I said, Hegel can't presuppose the absolute. He can't presuppose a method. In fact, William Maker has written about this quite explicitly, that, is there a Hegelian method? Well, if there is, it's certainly not one of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You get that a bit in Kant, I think, when he's deriving the different forms of judgment in different categories. You get it in Fichte, you get it in Engels later, but you don't get it in Hegel, because there can't be a method. There can't be a method that you can articulate in advance. And this is one of the most frustrating things, particularly for Kantians. Kantians hate this. Because one of the things that Kantians want to do is say that you have to be able to articulate the rules governing the thinking of any object before you can sort of think them. Or they have to be presupposed, they have to be articulable. But Hegel said, well, not in philosophy, because what we're trying to do in philosophy is discover what these categories are. So you can't presuppose the method in advance, because then you're not doing any discovery. So I would say there is no dialectical method, strictly speaking. And so if you read, for example, Michael Forster's article in the first Hegel Cambridge Companion to Hegel, which is about as wooden as it gets when it comes to reading it, that is very much, the method has to be concept, and all this. No, I don't think it can be that. Just in case you think I'm making this up, which you might think at various points in the course, page 43, which is DiGiovanni, page 23. It's the second paragraph of the introduction. 43 in the Miller, 23 in the DiGiovanni. Second paragraph. Logic, on the contrary, cannot presuppose any of these forms of reflection and laws of thinking, for these constitute part of its own content and are first to be established within the science. So you can't assume the law of non-contradiction. To be honest, you can't assume that it doesn't hold either. You can't assume that thinking will be dialectical. You can't assume that everything will be reconciled at the end. But does that mean it's all just, just chaos? Well, no. And in fact, Hegel is critical of the Romantics, as he sees them, for indulging in a kind of chaos in that way. If there is a method, what I've tried to highlight is this method of letting. Just the word to let, lassen. Now, you will... Obviously, those of you who work a lot on Heidegger will know that the word lassen is hugely important for Heidegger. Gelassenheit, for example. Well, it seems to me it's every bit, if not more important for Hegel. And if there is a key to the Hegel's method, it is this idea of letting. And Hegel uses it in conjunction with a lot of other terms. So there is letting go, for example, ablassen von. There is letting hold sway, which is gewähren lassen, which is one of his favorite terms. If there is a method of, it's that. It's gewähren lassen. It's letting hold sway. Not intervening, not being the one who poses the questions. Kant will say that we have to pose the questions, reason poses questions, that it then answers. And the whole philosophy of judgment in the 18th century is built around activity. And of course we do this in seminars, undergraduates. We're supposed to be encouraging you to be active in seminars, to think actively about it. Well, that's not philosophy for Hegel. What you do is thinking involves a kind of passivity that lets the matter of hand hold sway. Again, maybe you don't think that passive is a word that Hegel uses. Well, he does. This is in the addition to paragraph 238 to the Encyclopedia Logic. It's page 173 in the reader if you're using that. So it's Encyclopedia Logic, paragraph 238 in the Zusatz, the edition. And it goes like this.
Philosophical thinking proceeds analytically in that it simply takes up its object, the idea. At the beginning we don't know it's the idea, but it turns out to be that. And lets it go its own way. Für sich gewähren lässt. While it simply watches the movement and development of it, so to speak. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive, and the German word is passiv. Now you get the same in the introduction to the Phenomenology about the reines Zusehen, the pure looking on. But things aren't that simple, because passivity itself involves a certain activity. You've got to actively hold yourself to be passive, because you've got to keep at bay all the other aspects of your activity that constantly wanting to interfere. That little voice inside you that's constantly saying, but surely, Heidegger said, Wittgenstein said, but Aristotle said, you can't possibly be saying this. You've got to keep those at bay, banish them to the cellar, if you're going to allow the matter at hand to hold sway. So Hegel continues, but philosophical thinking is equally synthetic as well, and it proves to be the activity of the concept itself. But this requires the effort to beware of our own inventions and particular opinions, which are forever wanting to push ourselves forward. So passivity, as Hegel conceives it, is extremely effortful. It's the labour of the concept, the effort of the concept. And it is not only theoretically difficult, it's difficult in practice. It demands extraordinary concentration, as I'm sure you know, but then so do a lot of philosophers. And it does involve, as I say, splitting your brain in a way that one part of it can sort of concentrate on saying, okay, well, how must this unfold? While the other part of it is sort of mentally making a whole lot of critical objections that you keep to one side until you've understood it well enough to do that. Now, I think this is not just rhetoric. I suppose some of you could say, well, that's just language, this is rhetoric. I don't think it is rhetoric. I think this is absolutely crucial to how Hegel thinks and how Hegel thinks philosophy must think. Because I guess, although Hegel is thought of by Heidegger, for example, as the culmination of the tradition of subjectivity, Hegel is in many ways very close to Spinoza, in that he thinks that what it is to think truly is not so much for us to get it right, but for us to allow the truth to determine our thinking. That's how you get the truth. It's not our achievement that we do it right and we get it right, but that the truth manifests itself in our thinking. How do you do that? It's not who does it. There's no privileged who, because it's not an esoteric philosophy. It's all about the how. Anybody can do it, but there is a way, there is a how. And the how, Hegel thinks, at its simplest, has got to involve this element of letting. You've got to let the truth disclose itself, and you've got to keep your own objections at bay. And so what we will be trying to do, and what Hegel's trying to do, is just focus on the immanent development. What is it about being that means being vanishes into nothing? That means nothing vanishes back into being? That generates becoming? What is it about becoming that means we're taken on to Dasein? Now, it can be done wrong. Obviously, Hegel thought he did it wrong in the first edition, and he corrected it. So it's not an easy task, but he thinks that's what's going on. So I would say that's the method. If there's a method, it's that. Now, the problem with this, I guess, or there are a couple of problems with this. The method is going to be unique to each category. So the way the dialectic develops is not going to be the same in each case. And you've got to sort of be prepared for that, and not to think, when you get to a later category, oh, well, I'm being and nothing went like that. We're not doing that anymore. I know we're not doing that anymore, because if the method is immanent to the category, it's going to be generated by the category at hand. There is no single universal method. The method is the way a specific category develops. So can we criticize this? Well, what do you want to criticize? Let us say it's conceivable, maybe not in Hegel's logic, but it's conceivable that human thinking can let itself be governed by the truth. Why would you want to criticize the truth? Bizarre. Unless you want to assert what's not the truth against it. guess you could. I don't like the truth. I prefer to have this. So what are we criticizing? What we're criticizing, perhaps, is the way in which a particular philosopher has presented what he or she takes to be the truth. Fine. You can still do that in this case. There's nothing stopping you doing that in this case. You can look and see, has Hegel actually developed a system that is immanent? Has he smuggled in presuppositions when he shouldn't have done? Does the logic follow? In that sense, Hegel doesn't prevent you from exercising criticism any more than anybody else does. But it is a difficulty. Now, there's one other aspect of the method that I want to highlight briefly. And this is something that Hegel says in paragraph 88 of the Encyclopedia Logic. And it's in the little remark attached to it. And he's talking about being and nothing. And he says the following. This is paragraph 88 from the Encyclopedia Logic. He says, the deduction of their unity is to this extent entirely analytic. Just as quite generally the whole course of philosophizing, being methodical, i.e. necessary, is nothing else but the mere positing of what is already contained in the concept. The method is the positing of what is already contained in the concept. Right, two things. First of all, already there is a word you need to treat with caution. Because in many ways, Hegel's whole philosophy is against the idea of an already. It's about discovery. But I think what is very important is this idea of positing, rendering explicit what is implicit. Now it seems to me there we do work. I think we do this in the Phenomenology, I think we do it in the logic. So our job, our work, is to attend to what a particular category itself requires us to think. We let it hold sway and we're passive with regard to it. But it also requires us then to render explicit what is implicit. And that's really how you move from one category to another. So what Dasein does is render explicit a dynamic within becoming. What something does is render explicit a dynamic with Dasein. What infinity does is render explicit a dynamic with infinitude. And it seems to me that Hegel says that here, and that's pretty much the case. And of course, this is where Brandom gets the idea of making it explicit. That is absolutely Hegel. Thinking is the project of making it explicit. Except, I like the word rendering, because I don't like the pragmatist implications of making. Hegel's not a pragmatist. But the rendering explicit, I think, is. So it's a very different method. You know, if you're used to, I don't know, Descartes' meditations, he has his argument, he sends them out to his friends, they provide objections, and then he responds to them. Or think of, Mill's on liberty, here's my thesis, here's an objection, here's my counter-objection. The logic doesn't work like that. But there are reasons why it doesn't. Okay, let me say a little bit about the ontological claim, because what I've been focusing on so far is the kind of Kantian aspect, if you like, now the logic as a discovery of certain categories, and I think it is that. I think the logic is trying to do, again, what Kant does in the metaphysical deduction. Discover the categories. But, I've said, going through the reading list, Hegel regards the logic also as a metaphysics, as an ontology. Brady Bowman takes that view, Jane Kreiners takes that view, I take that view. I think that is right. Hegel says about it. Speculative logic is metaphysics. So how do we get an ontological claim out of this? Well, first of all, just to highlight the fact that I think the logic is meant to be setting out the basic forms of being. So it is doing what Parmenides was doing. It is doing what Aristotle, what Spinoza was doing. It's a post-Kantian Spinozicism, in many ways. A post-Kantian ontology. Of course, he's not the only one to think like that. You could think Deleuze, in some ways, is interested in a kind of post-Kantian ontology. But Hegel's got a particular version of that. So why? I mean, the obvious objection to Hegel here is, well, if you're that critical, shouldn't you surely suspend any judgments about whether thought is ontological or not? That's not how Hegel sees it. As I've argued already, Hegel thinks that if you are radically self-critical about thought, then thought reduces itself to nothing other than its own indeterminate being. But then you've also got to be radically self-critical about being. You can't take being to be substance, existence, nature, I-ness, whatever you happen to want it to be. So what are you left with? Utterly indeterminate, empty being. Being that is utterly indistinguishable from the pure being to which thought itself is reduced. So if Hegel's right, if you take that injunction to suspend all determinate substance seriously, both thought and being reduce down to the same utter indeterminate being. So there is no ground there for any gap to open up between the two of them. And indeed, Hegel thinks there is no such ground, no such gap in the logic. So the logic doesn't engage with the question, how do we know being through thinking? It assumes, if you like, that thinking is being is thinking is being is thinking is being. The unity of thought and being. The same metaphysical assumption you get in Parmenides that you get in Spinoza. Only Hegel thinks you get there not by stopping short of Kant, but by taking Kantian criticism to its logical conclusion. If you really think through the Kantian critical standpoint, then you're led to the point at which thought and being both reduce down to sheer immediate being. Okay, well, the importance of this is best seen in relation to Kant. For Kant, as you know, thought thinks possibility, the conceivable. So I think my $100, are there $100 there? Well, no, there aren't. How do I know there are $100 there? Well, because they're present in front of me in intuition. So it's intuition that gives me being, immediacy. Thought gives me conceptual structure, determinacy, possibility. Thought for Kant is not intuitive. Sensuousness is intuitive, or intuition is sensuous. For Hegel, intuition and thought collapse into one. So the logic is a work in intellectual intuition. But not a la Kant, because of course there's no object to begin with. Being is not an object. So the ontological claims follow from this radical self-criticism. And I think, again, going back to Descartes is helpful. If you follow the logic of the first meditation and get yourself to the point of the cogito, and then just take out the I, and what you're left with is thought thinking its own purely indeterminate empty being, and then say, well, what am I allowed to think being to be beyond that? Nothing at all. I can't just assume it's nature, it's I-ness, it's over there, it's a cosmos, because those are assumptions too. So in fact, what grounds have I got there for separating the two out? None. So for Hegel, logic must be ontology. Ontology without an object. And opening up a doubt, a gap. Oh, well, couldn't being be possibly be different from thought? All right, but then you've got to think being as, quote, possibly different from thought. What is possibility? Do you know what possibility is, such that you can think being as possibly different from thought? No, we don't know. We can't know that at the beginning of logic. So that conception of being as a possible beyond, Hegel thinks is a step too far. There is, of course, another way into this ontology, and that's the phenomenology. I've not mentioned the phenomenology so far. We're not dealing with the phenomenology here, but I want to just mention the phenomenology briefly. The phenomenology is an alternative route into the logic. Hegel thinks that you can get into the logic directly. If you look on 70 and 70 in the Miller, 48 in the DiGiovanni, 70 in the Miller, 48 in the Giovanni, just before the passage I read earlier, thus the beginning must be absolute. Hegel writes, all that is present is simply the resolve, the Entschluss, which can also be regarded as arbitrary, that we propose to consider thought as such. So that's the direct route into Hegel's logic. You resolve to think purely. You set aside your assumptions and just think. The pure indeterminacy of thought as being. But there's another way, phenomenology. Why do we need phenomenology? Well, because of ordinary consciousness. Because ordinary consciousness, as Hegel writes in the introduction to the phenomenology, ordinary consciousness is going to see this standpoint of philosophy as just
another assumption. So the phenomenology is meant to persuade ordinary consciousness that in fact the standpoint of philosophy is made necessary by ordinary consciousness itself. Now I'm not going to go into all of that, I'm looking at that in the undergraduate lectures. All I want to point out is that Hegel thinks that the development of the phenomenology also culminates in the unity of thought and being. Okay, I think what I'm going to do at this point, there are other things I want to say, but I'm going to stop because I want to give you just a few minutes, just sort of air any thoughts you've got. But can I remind you, again please, that next time we'll look at, with What Must Science Begin, we'll look at being, nothing and becoming. We'll have a proper break at 12. And also, before I forget, can I also remind you that the Tuesday talks are starting up. So it's Phil Lit tomorrow if you're able to go. But the Continental series is starting in week 3 on the 17th of October. We've got John Sellers who's coming to talk about Foucault and the Stoics, I think. Was a former student of ours. He's very, very good. So I hope you can all come to that. Anyway, so we haven't got very long, and I'll try and give longer in other sessions. But are there sort of questions about the overall project, what Hegel's doing, whether it's kind of plausible or... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just very confused. So you near the end you said you can't have doubt at this point, that you can't, because you don't have the possibility, you can't say, well, possibly this is something else because you don't have possibility at that point, right? And I'm wondering where the defense of this is supposed to come from, because it seems to me the defense is as much not, any sort of defense you have against a doubt is as much not present at that point as the attack. And so, yeah, thanks.
Well, I guess, I mean, Hegel, in the passage I read from here, he does think of this resolve as a work of radical skepticism. So he doesn't think of philosophy as requiring a defense against the doubt, but a kind of completion of the doubt. And his point would be, well, actually the point I'm making on his behalf here, is that if you stop at the thought, oh, well, the world might be different, that is not, in fact, taking doubt far enough. It's stopping with a might be, and indeed, it inevitably has with it a conception of being as itself possibly different from us. So that is to have a determinate conception of being as possibly different from our thinking. What on earth could justify that? Surely a radical skepticism for Hegel can allow no assumptions about being at all beyond the indeterminacy of being as such. So he sees that as a completion. He doesn't see that as defending against skepticism. Just as for Descartes too, the cogito doesn't come, as it were, as a defense against skepticism. It is the culmination of skepticism. It's where you get to if you are absolutely skeptical on Descartes' understanding. So what I'm trying to get at is that, and a broader question, is that forms of skepticism that stop short of where Hegel thinks we need to begin are not innocent in that they make assumptions about thinking, they make assumptions about being. And that's the idea. To think that being may differ from the way that I think it is to make a claim about being. That it may be different. It is possibly different. You know, that is an assumption that someone like Spinoza, for example, is going to say, well, show me why. I know it's sort of paradoxical and completely counterintuitive, I appreciate that. To think that somehow radical skepticism could lead you to the point at which being and thought are indistinguishable. But if you think of it in terms of an act of radical reduction, which is what this resolve basically is, stripping away everything we normally associate with thought and being, so that they're both reduced down to their absolute minimum, which in fact, as we'll see when we get to later, could in fact be nothing. Hegel will even say later on, in fact, we start with being, but we could just as easily start with nothing, because nothing converts itself into being. That's the logic of the way he's moving. And so I suppose you can see what is the historical presupposition of this. Well, I guess it is, thou shalt not take for granted anything at all.
Now, of course, we can question whether should we be under that categorical imperative. Well, I think Hegel thinks that is A, our historical situation, that's where we are. And B, actually, it's deeper than that that's a sort of an imperative within thinking itself. But clearly, if you don't accept that imperative, if you think, actually, that's not an imperative, I don't feel the need to suspend all my assumptions, I quite like assumptions, thank you very much. In fact, I'm Heidegger, and I think you can't think without projections and so on. Well, then clearly you're not going to enter into this way of thinking. But then for Hegel, you're never going to be able to discover, without already begging the question, what the categories are. Sorry, yes, you go first. And then, yeah.
So you mentioned that the method was kind of this letting happen of thinking, and then you also mentioned that kind of, it lets the truth sort of kind of speak to us as opposed to we let the truth. And I just wondered what that was, if not an assumption that the thinking kind of tends towards some kind of indefined notion of truth.
Well, it's not just indefined, it's completely indeterminate. I mean, in a
Sure,
sense,
so
it's not. Well, that's got to emerge, though. Remember, I mean, what the truth has to prove to be that which emerges, and it might well be that the letting that you engage with at the beginning of the logic stops there. I mean, my logic, as you can see, is falling to bits, which is pretty useful, because in a way you've got to read it as if there weren't the rest of the book there. And so what we need to do if we are not to make assumptions of our own about what being is simply let being be. You're right. We don't know that it's going to be anything. That might be we might have one sentence in a logic, being without further determination. Fine. That's the end of the story. And the book closes and we all go home. Now, in a sense, if we're being strict, we've got to be open to that possibility. So being itself has got to show itself to be more than just pure being. It's got to, as Hegel says, vanish into nothing. So yes, I take your point, exactly. One can't begin this with assumptions that there will be a truth that will emerge and that we've got to let it happen. Yeah, fair enough. I think that's perfect, that's good. In the course of the logic, however, that's what Hegel comes to understand the truth to be. That which emerges in and through our letting it happen, etc. Sorry, yes, Shadi.
Just going back to your point about philosophy rendering explicit whereas implicit, and you also mentioned that we should also try to focus on, I guess, the movement of thought, so that the logic basically of how he moves from one. So in some ways it seems Hegel's quite close to Leibniz insofar as he thinks, insofar as everything is analytic or implicit to thought. Is that true?
I did say one's got to be a little bit careful here. Hegel's understanding of implicit. Could you just tell me, is there anyone waiting outside there?
Sorry.
Is anybody waiting outside?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, all right, good. Okay. So we better stop in a minute, but I don't want to be overrunning my time too much. It's not exactly Leibniz's notion of analyticity, because in a sense, the thinking's got to almost sort of render explicit that it is implicit. It's not sort of, it's just there, like in a box. So, for example, take pure being. That's how it starts. It's indeterminate. Now, by the end of the logic, we know that pure being is idea. And we know there's a whole lot of other concepts as well. So, looking back, we obviously know that pure being is implicitly idea. But you've got to work that out. You can't just sort of look at it and sort of, peel back the layers. Oh, there it is, I can see it. It's not like a little homunculus sort of sitting in there. Which is, in a way, how Leibniz sort of thinks of everything that's true of us as being contained within my monad. So one's got to be a little bit careful of that. And of course, remember, for Leibniz, it says nothing new emerges. Whereas Hegel's process of rendering explicit what's implicit actually takes us to new categories. So Dasein, becoming is not being. Dasein is not becoming. So I think it's rather a matter of attending to what is there and paying special, and then attention to it, and then working out what is implicit in that and where that takes us. It'll become clearer when we sort of do it, basically. But I'm glad you mentioned the Leibniz, and I would say, no, Leibniz is a kind of misleading example, because Leibniz makes it sound, a Leibnizian reading of Hegel makes it sound as if it's all contained there in the beginning, and you just got to take off the lid and sort of pull it out. And I don't think that's fair. All right, I think perhaps I better let you go. Thank you very much for being here, attentive audience. I'm sorry that I didn't...